Hello and welcome to this very special webinar, Underwater, addressing today's data center cooling challenges to enable tomorrow's innovations, presented by LiquidStack and ECS, Equus Compute Solutions. Thanks for joining. Our presenters today will unpack the significant challenges around data center cooling, including how advances in AI development and deployment have fast-tracked the need for innovative and meaningful cooling solutions. Importantly, our panelists will provide a detailed look at where the market is today and why it's where it is today. They'll define the data center energy problem, including how AI has exacerbated these challenges, and offer some real-world solutions available right now. So let's go ahead and jump in without further ado. Let's go ahead and meet these good-looking experts that we have today. They are Mr. Jay Lawrence. Jay is the CEO of ECS, and Mr. Joe Capes. Joe is the CEO of LiquidStack. Gentlemen, let's go ahead and get right into it, shall we? Jay, I'm going to start with you on the liquid cooling market drivers and challenges. Question number one for you, Jay, is what are the current market trends and drivers in or of liquid cooling growth?
Well, Dean, thanks. But before I go there, I think you need to get your glasses checked because you called us good looking. I got a great face for radio. But it's really kind of the question right now in the space. When you look across the compute platform, the business that ECS has been in for 30 plus years, what's true is that Moore's law has been destroyed. There's more power consumption. And by the way, nobody's buying less compute. Nobody's going to say, turn off my Netflix, make my iPhone work worse than it already does, or anything of that sort. They want more. And globally, I think everyone who is reading a newspaper or watching the news understands that there's a power shortage. And AI is exacerbating that power shortage substantially. And I had the privilege of being an author in that Greener Data book earlier this year. And part of the whole message in that book was we got to figure out how to preserve what we have while we're figuring out how to build what we need. So the only way to get from A to B is through liquid cooling. And part of the really nice relationship and friendship that, Joe and I have built between ECS and LiquidStack is we aren't just talking about it. We've done it. We've had LiquidStack technology in our innovation lab for over a year. Happy to report it's worked flawlessly running AI workloads with multiple software partners. And until we figure out how to do the preservation, we're not going to be able to get from here to there. One, two, the other thing that is true, just beyond the power question, is the density. When you start putting compute into a tank, you compress the amount of three-dimensional space required to actually do the compute workloads. And that's a big deal when you figure that 5 and then soon 6G is going to push everything that we're doing away from big data centers to the edge. So being able to put a lot more compute in a smaller three-dimensional space with substantial up to 40% power savings is huge. And again, we're not talking about it. We've done it. Mm-hmm. Then the other bit comes into where you go next. And then you start looking at AI. You would talk about AI. Well, AI is still a baby. There's going to be 35,000 flavors of AI in a couple of years. And you're going to need so much diversity and new complexities and what have you. And that's just going to be all enabled by using liquid cooling. Now, the other bit that I think is also important, you look at density, you look at the ability to go to the edge, and those things matter. But the green factor, again, I'm not a green guy, but I think if you can do something good for the environment while you're doing something good for the economy at the same time, we're doing that. So I think, off the tip, and I think the other big point here too, that folks have to understand is we're over the asymptote of where air cooling is even legitimate. You can't go to a car lot today and buy an air-cooled car. Well, if you want to go get like a Model T, that's great, but you're going to pay for that. We're now in the buggy whip to Ferrari shift in terms of how the world is evolving, and the partnership between ECS and LiquidStack, I think, is a perfect metaphor for how we go from where we were to where we have to go, because just 2 years ago, NVIDIA's hottest chip was the V100, and that was what, 400 watts. We're not talking about 12, 14, 1500 watt GPUs, densely packed. You absolutely have to make the migration to using Liquid to be successful in this day and age, period, end of sentence.
Jay, you bring up a lot of interesting points in that, but we're really going to focus on the liquid cooling. However, you also made me remember that I had a late 60s Volkswagen, an air-cooled late 60s Volkswagen, and it did make me miss that Volkswagen. But you mentioned that there are a number of flavors of AI. I don't think that there's as many flavors of liquid cooling, but it should be said that there are more than one flavor of liquid cooling. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the various types of liquid cooling technologies that are currently being adopted in the market?
Well, there's really, I think, three predominant flavors. So you have this thing called a rear door heat exchanger, which, by the way, is effective. And for some workloads, it's suitable for now. And a rear door heat exchanger is kind of what it sounds like. It bolts onto the back of a server rack, and it looks like a radiator that would be in the next generation of your Volkswagen Bug. Works a little bit better. Then you've got another flavor called directed chip. And in that case, you basically are miniaturizing the rear door heat exchanger and replacing the heat sinks, the air heat sinks that are on chips, with a vaporator that pulls heat off the chips. Then you get into full immersion. And here's the point about the asymptote that matters. The chips are getting so hot, and the want to use them at full duty is so important, because, again, back to the car metaphor, why buy a Ferrari with only the first and second gear in the transmission? I mean, I don't know what fool would do that. What LiquidStack permits us to do is, as we're building these solutions out, is extract all this thermal frustration that is real and use the entire velocity and capability of these chips at high density. So while they're, and by the way, there's always a right tool for the job argument. So I'm not saying that one thing has to be used all the time, but the trend is your friend. And the trend here is for what we're doing with Joe and his team in terms of maximum density, maximum heat reduction and extraction. And even in the immersion, there's single phase and dual phase. And by the way, LiquidStack has great solutions to support directed chip that we're involved with. But the point is that full immersion capacity for maximum heat extraction is where we're headed. There's just no escaping it. The chips aren't going to get cooler. People aren't going to buy less compute. AI is going to become more complex. And we'll be calling AI something else too. I mean, think about it this way. 20 years ago, for those of us who are old enough to remember flip phones, to text, you were tapping on the buttons 3 or 4 times to find the right letter or number. And if you missed it, it was like, I got to go back around. Now we got iPhones and smartphones where the phone, ironically, I don't even know why we call it a phone. The phone's the least used application on the device. That's a great metaphor for where AI is heading. And when you think about what 5G is doing, soon to be 6G, in terms of distributing the architecture that we're going to have to work within, we're going to be at the edge where there's a lot less highly available volumes of power, a lot more need for compute to address latency, network diversity, highly available systems. And the value proposition, the investment that goes into these systems is, it's used to be thousands, then millions. Now we're talking about billions of lines of code that are driving these very complex systems. They need to be in an environment. And one other thing that we happen to believe, based on the fact that we've had LiquidStack working in our innovation center for a year plus with no issue whatsoever, is the servers are actually going to live more comfortably. It's just like a asphalt road. If you live in the north, the thermals go up in the summer, it's hot as heck, and then it's freezing cold in the winter, you get cracks. Well, what's inside of a chip? Glass, silicon. So the more thermally static we can kind of keep these environments, which is another real big benefit, there's actually a longevity argument. Plus, you don't get dust bunnies on top of the circuit board. You're not dropping screws, from taking fans out and doing other things. It's a much more confined, much more stable, much more deterministic environment with all the other benefits of the 40% power savings, of the ability to live at the edge, of the ability to help manage for folks like us that are building these very complicated workloads, do it and have full duty on the chips that are going in.
Now that all makes sense. What is the saying? If a good body came in a bottle, we'd all have one, kind of thing. So there are. It's not as it sounds. Like everything that you're describing sounds simple. Let's just do this. But clearly there are challenges to this kind of immersion cooling adoption. Why don't you speak to some of those challenges?
Well, I'm happy to, because it is naive to think this is just sort of like taking some fans off a server and dropping them in a bathtub. It's much more than that. As a factual matter, you have questions of power distribution, networking, full integration, all of which are major and very complex matters when you look at the overarch of how do you make this work and work right. There's no point, by the way, of leveraging the benefits that full immersion has and only getting the output of a 30 kilowatt air-cooled rack. You want the 300 kilowatt, fully immersed, fully networked outcome. But when you start looking at the deployment of this, then you start getting into some interesting questions. And that's why I happen to very strongly believe that this all is part of what drives us to the edge, to the greenfield, where there's so much opportunity, by the way. And I mean, we're getting a call every other day saying, please help us solve this problem, because folks are realizing, if I'm going to try to put a 300 kilowatt rack, or I think in this case, a 252 kilowatt tank in an Equinix data center, it's sort of like trying to plug your dryer into where your microwave goes. They don't even know how to deal with this problem. Mm-hmm. So the answer is, well, let's kick the can down the road. Well, no, we're going to kick the can to the edge and do it where the customer lives anyway, where 5G is driving us anyway, where the revenue is anyway. So there's a lot of really interesting things that are changing and evolving. But the network, again, I'm a recovering telecom guy. So in my experience, the network always drives where the compute goes. Because again, just even radios are nothing more than cores going to antennas, going to transmission. With AI and with the liquid and the power challenges that we face, migrating to the edge in the way that we are is where the solutions live, and you get away from these problems. I mean, if you think about these big data centers right now, one of the difficulties they have, and I'm a big fan of the big data centers, don't get me wrong, but 5G kind of said to the central office, you're going to the edge. So the data centers kind of have to move to the cell tower. They have to move to the Industry 4.0 site. They have to move to where the telemedicine is. They have to move to where the autonomous vehicles are. We need more internet exchange points. We need more interconnectivity. And by the way, in all those sites, you don't necessarily have a bazillion watts of a substation. You've got some leftover that you have to figure out how to maximize the utility of that power to drive everything else. Without liquid, it gets really hard to get from here to there.
Excellent. Jay, thank you for those insights. Joe, help us understand exactly what this all means. Jay, as Jay said, it ain't just dropping a rack in a bathtub. What exactly is it? Why don't you talk to us a little bit about exactly what immersion cooling is and the advantage of immersion cooling over some other cooling methods?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us, Dean. And when Jay was talking about rear door heat exchangers, I started to get a little weepy-eyed because my second startup was the first company to commercialize rear door heat exchangers. IBM actually created the technology back in 2002, but it didn't make its way into the market in a relevant sense until 2007. That wasn't that long ago, and I can tell you that in 2007 to 2010, a lot of people in our industry thought that putting a coil on the back of an IT rack and filling it with chilled water or with a refrigerant was crazy talk, right? Like why would you bring liquid to the rack? Why would you want to bring liquid into the white space? And so the reason why I bring this up is because the data center industry is inherently risk averse and unwilling to change unless there are factors that are driving the change. And the first factor is based on the chips that Jay talked about. So, with the chipsets being now in the range of 1,000 watts TDP, what we've learned, right, is that when you hit around 270 to 300 watts TDP, total dissipated power, the physics of air cooling these semiconductor chips is really difficult, right, and inefficient and more costly. But we're living in a world where a majority of data centers are air cooled, and that means if they haven't pre-piped for liquid distribution, it's pretty disruptive. It's difficult to go into an operating white space, in let's say an Azure facility or an AWS facility or a co-location facility, and say, okay, first of all, you can't turn off client workloads, right? They have to be operating, 5 nines. And I think as a result, you're seeing a rush right now to build new data centers. It means that time to power is a critical issue. As Jay mentioned, there are significant constraints with power in places like Northern Virginia, California, and we're seeing new markets start to bubble up, no pun intended, to the surface in places like Atlanta, where you're seeing a lot of new builds happen. That doesn't mean that a retrofit of a data center for liquid cooling is impossible, but what it does mean is that you have to take practical considerations to, how to approach those projects without disrupting the white space. One of the things that's kind of interesting is a lot of these data centers have mechanical galleries anyway, right? So if they were designed where there were crack units or craw units or air handling units in a mechanical gallery, that infrastructure can be fairly easily replaced with liquid cooling infrastructure like coolant distribution units or CDUs that help support direct to chip. If you're retrofitting an existing data center for immersion, what you're typically doing is removing your hot or your cold aisles and replacing your conventional IT racks with immersion data tanks. And as Jay mentioned, immersion is one approach to solving these thermal challenges. There's both two-phase and single-phase immersion cooling. They have differences in their fluid types and their ability to reject heat and their performance and efficiency. But just like Jay said, there's a few ways to solve the problem, and immersion is one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
hey, I just want to just add a little something there, because Joe raises a really good point. And when you look at the traditional big 300,000 square foot data center, ask yourself, what's the hottest point in that building? And it's the three-dimensional middle spot where to subtract the heat, which is the challenge here, without just, huge power expense, fluorocarbon utilization, and other things in HVACs, which, by the way, is not clean, is not green, is not helpful, and is, by the way, we're over the asymptote. Point one. Point two, though, is when you look at the TDPs of these chips that are coming out, I mentioned early in my first response to your question that we're past the asymptote of fans. Now we're getting into how do you distribute against the 5G infrastructure at the edge, where you're getting the maximum amount of density per unit watt, per unit chip, per unit core. And if you break it down that way, you kind of get to the conclusion pretty quick that full immersion is going to be the predominant answer for solving that problem. And it is a lot more than just throwing, servers into bathtubs, because again, you've got to think through all of the complexities. And then you start getting into the complexities of by application. What do I need? Right? So Industry 4.0 has robots and sensors. Well, you could say, well, so does telemedicine. But I think we could agree the real-time performance in a telemedicine application might be a little bit more severe than in Industry 4.0. But then you've got the same thing with autonomous vehicles, all of which are going to need this kind of compute capacity distributed with a lot of power requirements all over the continent and continents. So again, what we're looking at here is transformational. And I've always said I am not a green guy unless it makes me green, meaning dollars. And the amount of good things that can be done for the environment, coupled with the good things that can be done for society, coupled with the good outcomes that customers can have through this combination of capacities between what LiquidStack has and what we're doing, is generational.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really great points, Joe and Jay. The last one, when real time really means real time, is an interesting concept to me. Also, the concept of kind of like what the digital infrastructure, what the data center of the future. Remember those cartoons, like the car of the future, the home of the future. Like, what does the data center of the future would be? Something I would love to spend an afternoon discussing with you guys. Unfortunately, we do not have an afternoon. But it does bring me to my final question, Joe, and I'm going to ask this one for you too, is when does it actually make good sense to adopt an immersion strategy? It feels like it should be now, but that's probably not the answer.
That's a great question. So first of all, immersion cooling has been in use for over a decade, and crypto miners really were the first ones to embrace the technology and to get it, its full practical benefit. And that's because some of the miners started developing boards that were specifically engineered for immersion, right? So, the analogy is if you're starting out a project to build an aircraft, you're going to approach it very differently if you're building a commercial airliner versus a military, jet, right? And I think one of the amazing things that ECS is doing, right, is optimizing the design of the IT hardware to take the full benefit of immersion. Because when you're laying out a board, right, and you're using air cooling, you have to provision space for fan banks, and you have to have sufficient height or use space in the server design to accommodate increasingly larger air heat sinks, right? All this stuff takes up a lot of space. Now, if you're designing for immersion on day one, and if you're, for example, using two-phase liquid immersion cooling, you're not using any fans, right? So, a board might be reduced by 300 or 400 millimeters just by eliminating the fans. And then if you're going from, let's say, a high density 4U high server, and you're removing the air-cooled heat sinks and replacing them with BECs, boiling enhancement coatings, now you can reduce the volume height of that server maybe from 4U down to 2U or 1U. So what ECS brings to the table is the integration and optimization of the hardware on day one. And what that allows us to do together is to implement the highest density liquid cooled solutions that are available in the market today, up to 252 kilowatts in a 48U data tank form factor. And the last comment I have is a couple of months ago, Google came out and said that it's not unreasonable to think that we'll have 1 megawatt racks in the future. And we're in an industry that grew up on 5 to 10 kilowatt racks. We're talking about 100x increase in rack density. There's a Schneider Electric paper that just recently came out that's supporting the same thesis. So this is real. This is here now, and customers that are looking for integrated solutions can go to a company like ECS and be able to deliver quickly and with proven technology.
Very good. Go ahead,
I'm going
Jay.
to expand that real quick, Dean, because I love the airplane metaphor only because I would add to it, when you look at traditional versus the contemporary for what's coming up in the data center world, you don't want to be changing the wings on the airplane in flight. And it's that kind of a geometric shift that we're facing as an industry. And I do agree that, again, we can do a 300 kilowatt rack right now. That's already a big multiple for what the contemporary is. But what it means too is look at the enabling forcing function that creates for customers. It's substantial. The fact that you could put as much compute capacity in literally 3 or 4 or 5 LiquidStack tanks with our compute and our tech and our integration and our networking, and that's now a shipping container size thing compared to tens of thousands of feet. Not only are we saving 40% of the power, not only closer to the customer for latency, able to build 3 or 4 or 5 of them for network diversity and network architecture support, but we're also ripping up less grass.
Yeah.
And that, all of that together is, I think, the substantive componentry that you have to look at, which is why, and I always love to say this, you know this about me, my favorite business equation, 1 + 1 is greater than 3. Joe and I right now, I think we've perfected 1 + 1 is greater than 4.
Great.
Outstanding, you guys. And that is it for time. So we're going to go ahead and leave it there. Great insights as always, guys. Let's do this again in like 6 months or so. I'm sure that there is a myriad things that we can continue to talk about. So
we'll
thank
have
you.
Stories to tell. We'll have stories to tell.
You bet. You bet.
All right.
You bet.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. And thank you to our viewers. This has been Underwater, addressing today's data center cooling challenges to enable tomorrow's innovations, brought to you by ECS and LiquidStack. We'll see you soon.